Hello everybody. Today I'd like to do a tutorial on how to build a website from Photoshop. There's our Photoshop design to code it with Bootstrap so that actually looks like this. And yes, if we actually draw it smaller, then it is responsive. Okay, it's not 100% responsive. We have to work on things like media queries, but at least it's starting to take shape. So first things first, this video is going to be in a few parts because it's going to be quite long. So make sure that you watch every part consecutively so that you don't miss anything. All right, so if we go to Photoshop, first I want to say that I'm going to try to do this as quick as possible. First, I want to say that every part that you actually design in Photoshop needs to be in its own folder, and within that folder, you really need to ensure that you label your content in such a way that it makes sense and that it's easy to code. So what is in the nav bar should be in a folder in the nav bar so that you really know every little part, what we call the atoms of the design. You can read about atomic design. It's really, really powerful. Every atom together makes this molecule, which makes this organism, which we call a nav bar. So when you design in Photoshop or you design in XD, make sure that you group every section that you're going to code or every component, group it in a folder that it makes sense. So here at the top, I have a nav bar and I have my handshake area. Inside of my handshake, I will then have a row and in that or a column, or I can do a jumbotron. And then obviously I have an H1, I have some P's, and I have my large button. My second section will then be my range. For the moment, I'm not going to do a slider. I'm actually just going to do two horizontal cards. I have a big, large H. Then I have a range section with cards as well. I think we're going to do a card group. Then we have a testimonial. Again, I'm just going to, for this exercise, I'm just going to do one section, not necessarily a slider. Then I have a carousel. That is going to have some sliders in, and last but not least, I'm going to have a footer. So that is in a nutshell how you would actually group every part, every section inside of Photoshop so that it's easy to code. So here's the actual code. Here's what it looks like inside of Atom. All right, I'm doing this in Atom. You can use brackets, you can use Sublime. It doesn't really matter. Any kind of HTML editor. And what I've done here is I've started my very large page, if you want to call it that, and I've used the section element, and I've placed it in a container fluid. Now, the difference again between container fluid in Bootstrap and container is that container fluid is the total width of your actual screen. It is the total width of your device. All right. Also important, guys, please comment. Comment for yourself. So I have said this is the start of my nav bar. Every time that you put something from Bootstrap into your actual file, make sure that you actually comment it. Then it will help you to make sure that you open a div and you close a div. In this case, I've opened container fluid, and right here at the bottom, remember it is in Atom, it's selected. So if I go right at the bottom of my page, then I see my section. So I have indeed actually closed it. Okay, so that is super, super important. As I said, I've put it in a container fluid. This thing here at the top, just as a refresher, if you want your jump links, if you want About Us as a link to go to About Us in this page, then you need this little tag component, which is a name and home. Super important because otherwise your links won't work. Okay. So what have I done? So I'm not necessarily going to take you really step by step, bringing in components from from Bootstrap because that is self-explanatory. But what I am going to just talk is how I've amended it and how I've changed the copy and what do I need to do to actually make the nav work in a way that I wanted to use. Okay, so I have actually used the nav bar light, the big expand large nav. I've created my own, which I'll talk about now. I've created my own little class called my nav, and then obviously because I want it to stay at the top, I want to use the fixed top CSS that's part of Bootstrap in order for my nav bar to be sticky, as we call it. Okay, and then obviously I have everything, as I said, from Bootstrap. I have, if we look at this component, I have added an image there so that I can have a logo there. Very important, make sure that you always use the right path to your images. So this is image / go to Lux logo top nav PNG, because in that case, it actually go and find it in an image folder. As you can see in Atom, it actually shows you. Okay, then also important, I want to make this an image fluid, so it means that it is actually responsive, and then also put your width and your height in there so that HTML has some kind of idea of what the size of that object is. The rest you can leave because that is your navbar toggler. Always just remember that if the navbar toggler doesn't work, then you have to actually go and play around with it in the actual Bootstrap CSS style sheet. Okay, again, if you want it to, if I just take the ML out for now and I save it, you'll see what that is going to do. So if I go there, ML Auto will actually help you to place your nav to the right side of your nav bar. Okay, so that is by default what it will look like. All right, but the minute that I actually use my ML Auto CSS style sheet, it will align to the right of my page. Okay, then obviously remember to put your actual links in. If it goes to this page, the href is always with a hash sign, about, hash sign range, hash sign specials, etc. If it goes to obviously another page in your website, then you will go to, say, range.html. If it goes to social media, then obviously it is a full URL. And then we're going to put our actual links in. So this all lives in a component that I put in inside of a row. For me, it's just easier to actually really use what Bootstrap has given me. So yes, my very large component lives in a container fluid, but in fact, this first part I will put in a row. Remember always to do a little CSS style called red border. And if you're not 100% sure, then the red border will actually tell you exactly where this component sits. So in this case, row is there and it doesn't actually mean anything because I didn't actually specify the height of this row. Okay. If I place it, for instance, in here, then you will see exactly where your nav bar is sitting. So that's quite a weird little thing. I've got a hover over that where I need to take that out. But anyway, we will talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so what did I do to my own nav? So just remember again that yes, you're going to use the Bootstrap CSS, but then you're going to write your own CSS. And I'll just go through again a few of the basics that always needs to be in your styles.css. So I start with body, comma, HTML, comma, the asterisk. That's meaning all elements. Why is it commas? Because commas in HTML and CSS rather means and. So for body and HTML and all other elements, I want to take the margin and the padding down to 0. Just remember why we're doing that is because browsers add their own little quirks. I also want to indicate that both body and HTML is always going to be a height of 100%, meaning that the element will actually the element height will remain at 100%. We're not scaling this. Then I am putting in a font family, Roboto Sans Serif, meaning that I am changing all the fonts to Roboto Sans Serif. Just remember, if you use Google Fonts, remember that that entire style sheet has to be there at the top in your links. I've also tripled it. So I'm using Pinion, Playfair, and Roboto. So if you go to Google Fonts, it will show you how you can actually create one style sheet and you can actually put all three in them. This one we will talk about later. This is for using Font Awesome, and that is for all your very specific iconography for your social media. And then again, while we are here, yes, the style sheet for your CSS goes to Bootstrap, CSS bootstrap.css, and CSS styles.css. You can make it mild style, styles one if you play around, and some people even do styles print, styles screen. But I think it's nice if you just have one style sheet. Okay, so if we go back to styles, then I've just played here with something. Don't worry about this too much for now. Going back to body, I've changed my font size to 62.5%. What does that do? That actually takes down the original font size of body, which is 16px, down to 10, which means that for us that's not great with maths, we can do 1 em and then we know it's 10. Whereas if we stick to 100% font size, then the math just gets out of hand. This is a little trick that you have to do for asterisk. So box sizing is border box, meaning that that's got to do with the size inside of HTML. And then we're going to use the A tag of text decoration none. And that is quite important because no link should have an underline. Okay, UL always is list style type none, and then these two for now, again, don't worry about that. That is just my my little font awesome that I put in there. And then again, container fluid is padding 0. I'm a bit of a control freak, so I put that in there. There is my little tester, red border, and then there's some other general text. So I've made a CSS for paragraphs called body text, and I'm styling my body text at 18. At 18px. So from the get-go, these are all my general styles. So from the get-go, I actually say that all body text or all P's that have a body text class attached to it is going to be 1em and that color. Remember, that will always come from a UI style sheet, so UI style guide. So you've created a UI style guide for your website, and you have applied already styles for paragraphs. And then there's some links here, which we'll talk about later. And here comes my nav. So my nav in the width is 100%. The font size again is 1.8 em. Text transform obviously is uppercase because I want it to be caps. Font weight in this case is bold, and I've used the font Playfair display. It's a little bit different from what I've designed, but I will speak to you about that as well. And then the color is brown. And the minimal height is 4 em. So from Photoshop, I can gather what is that minimum size. Remember always to work with guides as well. So from Photoshop, I can go and I can measure it. Just go and take your marquee and just measure that size. If we go to window and we bring up our info palette, we can see that the height is 217. So in fact, I can go in here and I can say that the min height should be 300, but I've kept it quite big. And then the background color in this case, I've made it slightly transparent white. And the reason being is that when this becomes sticky, I do want to be able to actually read my text. Whereas sometimes when you design in Photoshop, you don't necessarily can see what you're actually designing. So then when you start to build, oh, if you want to use a sticky, I must actually be able to read my nav, and thus I have added that transparent background color. So obviously it's white. For the best background color class or CSS style is to use RGBA, because you can actually add the A there, which is obviously the alpha or the opacity. All right, and then I've added in my nav links, I have now added a padding bottom. Why do you ask? The reason being is that I want my border to actually drop down a little bit. So just again, make sure that you understand the components of an actual nav inside of Bootstrap. So the LI is a nav item, but the A, which is your actual little link, is nav link. So if you want to actually style that link, then we have to talk of a nav link and not just the nav item. Okay, so if I go back here, that is why I'm styling that specific text. That text lives in nav link, so I am adding a padding bottom to nav link and not nav item. Nav item is just the mother component, which is the li. Obviously, for all links, you got to have hovers and visitors, visitors classes. And in this case, I have kept the color the same, and then I've added a bold to hover and a border bottom to, let's do a border bottom at 4, and then you'll see it. So if I do a border bottom at 4, then that line becomes very dark, okay, or thicker. Again, important, it is my nav, and if I have an A link in my nav, this is what it's going to look like. Remember, if it is one tag within another tag or a class, you need a space. If you are saying and for CSS, then you have to create a comma or add a comma there. Okay, and also very important, the flow of links are super important, as in what comes first. A link is always first, then it's visited, and last it's hover. It will not work if the chronological order of these three, and sometimes you can put focus in there as well, if these three are not correct. Okay, all right, so I hope you understand it. If we go back to HTML, that is there for our nav. What else lives in this area? Well, next is going to be our actual handshake, which is that very large image. What lives in the handshake, you ask? Well, it is the very big image, plus it is a headline, then it's some text, and then it is our large button. Okay, so I am now using a container within a container. Okay, so I'm using a container fluid within another container fluid. You ask why? I suppose there isn't a reason, but again, I quite like to control things very much for myself. So that I really know where things are. Inside that container fluid, I'm adding another container. Again, this is, if I add the red border, you'll see what that means. This is the smaller container that is inside, and this is so that I can actually align this content. All right, I think there is a little bit of a problem here. I'm going to add a class of row. Sorry, there always has to be a row. In fact, when you add a am I missing something? So I'm missing something here. This is my Jumbotron. I'm just going to enter that. This is my, yeah, I am missing one div. Okay, so this is my Jumbotron. This is my div class column. This is my row. This is my container, and that should be that. Unless I am missing something that yeah. So again, the reason why we're doing that is we need to work within a row. Now you can take this container out if you only want to use. It's not going to make a big difference. But the fact of the matter is that that container, I'm using that container so that I am using 960 and not the total width. So I hope you understand that. For us to use columns, we actually have to use a row. My bad. You have to use a row before you actually use a column. Why am I using large 8 and small 12? Well, that is the setting that I'm going to use for this specifically. All right, so it is not a 6. Oh, my text is a little bit larger. Okay, then I'm using an A. I have put a jumbotron in there just to play around with it, but it's not really doing anything. Then I'm using a very specific H1 class called headline. Because it's a jumbotron, I have already a lead, which I changed, and then I use a very big button. Okay, so this is the first section that I want to talk about. So what does handshake look like? Well, if you look at this, then surely you must by now know that handshake is a background image because there's no image in here. All right, there's only an H. I'm just going to soft wrap this. So we can see there is no image in here. There's no image in the actual HTML. So if there is an image in the browser, then surely in Handshake, there must actually be an image, and it's a background image. So, okay. So yes, first I'm going to, let's just do the order a little bit better, Anka. This is terrible. So first I'm talking about Handshake. What does Handshake look like? So again, just remember, if you are in CSS and you allude to an image, then you have to have your root dots, meaning from this folder, go out, go into IMG. So that is why there are these two dots, which means go out and in for the /. Okay, again, if you do not have the correct path, then your image won't work. So yes, indeed, this is a background image. I'm giving it a lot of padding. Why? So if I should have taken out the padding, so I'm just going to cut this for now. If I take out the padding, what is going to happen? What do you think? Okay, well, you don't really see it. Let's take out the margin. Let's take out the margin. Boom, it takes it's right to the top. So in this case, the reason why I put both padding and margin in there is to move my content. All right, so let's just save this. All right, to move my content down. All right, the reason why I put padding in is so that nothing in this container or in this row should start too high. So that is why I put in some padding. Margin is so that I have space for my nav bar. Otherwise, my image will be right under my nav bar, and that is not how it was designed. So again, remember, in a block, if you want to move contents in a block down, then you use padding. If you want the whole object to be lower down, you use margin, because margin is on the outside of a block, padding is on the inside of a block. Minimum height is very, very big because this image is very big. Background size is always an issue. So you can use background size cover. Now I'll show you the difference between the two. So normally, to use a really nice responsive background, we'll use cover. Okay, so if I go in here, you might not see a big difference, but you see a very big difference in responsive. So it's not fully responsive. Okay, so what is quite important is to actually use this little trick, which is 100% auto, which means that it will be 100% on the device and on the width of its parent object, which is super important. Background position, how do you want it to fit? So I can, at this stage, I'm putting top in. You can also do a center. It might not have, in this case, might not have a massive difference, or you might not see a massive difference because my block is actually the same size. But if you want to move this object slightly up or you want to move it down, then you use background position. All right, so I will obviously use it as top. I wanted to start from the top and then move it down. But if you actually want to see a center part of the image and you didn't crop it correctly in Photoshop, then you can use center. You can also use center, sometimes that works. Background repeat in this case is no repeat because I do not want this image to repeat. All right, so let's talk about our H1. This is a very specific H1. I can also actually do this. I can do H1 headline handshake. Why? It's the same. All right, so you can be semantically very correct by putting the H1 in front of your actually class, but you don't have to. HTML is very clever. So if I go back to my HTML page, yes, there it is. I've got an H1 class of handshake, and then I've got a P class of my lead. All right, so, or my lead. So yes, it is opinion. That is my very cursive font. Font weight, just remember, some fonts do not have specific weight. So they don't have light and bold. But what CSS has done, it's given us, I think there's 100 to 900. They've given us pseudo weights. All right. So if you want to make your font that doesn't have a weight, bold, thicker, you can. So if we look at font weight 100, it's not going to be as bold. If we take this down or up to 600, it's going to become even bolder. All right, so that's a little trick that some of you might not know, and that is to actually create better values or better font weights on fonts that do not have. Font size is massive. It's 120 actual pixels. Again, if we actually look at our size inside of Photoshop, there it is much higher. There it is 240, but if we actually look at our size, just going to refresh it. If we actually look at our size in CSS, it's okay. All right, and that's the whole thing about, you know, designing in Photoshop and building. Nothing is always, unless you have a UI style guide, but nothing is always set in stone. And a lot of clients sometimes forget this. Clients sometimes think that if they've seen something in Photoshop, the HTML is going to look exactly the same. And I always have to tell my clients, that's not really how it works. It's a very good guide, but it's not set in stone. Margin top is 1 EM. Why? I want this to be a little bit lower. What is my lead? It is my actual font, and then obviously my large button. Okay, so what I've done in my actual HTML, I have created a button, all right, with an A class. Remember, if you want to style the button, then the A, which is your link, let's call it your trigger, must have a class. Okay, it's not the type that has a class. All right, it's the entire button that is a link, and it's the entire area that therefore needs a CSS. So Lux BTN main is then my actual CSS. This doesn't go anywhere for now, so I'm just going to put a hash sign there. What is its role? Its role is button. What is its name? So if we now go back to our CSS, then you will see that again I have 3 states. So I have Lux button main. I'm doing a pseudo class of link and visited, and then I'm giving it some styling. Margin top. Why? I want to move this button down from its predecessor, from the pre-component inside of HTML. What is its background color? It's brown. Giving it a padding. Always buttons need padding because obviously you don't want your text to sit from side to side in the color. What is the font size of the text? I want it uppercase. What is the color of the font, etc., etc. And then obviously I have to have my hover as well. And if we look at the browser, yes, it's kind of a green color. Okay, so remember the size of your button is actually determined by the size of the font as well as the actual padding. All right, so that is really, really important. Okay, so that is our first area that we're going to talk about. So we've got a nav bar with a logo in it. I'll fix that now. That's quite weird. And then I have my my headline there, which is an H1. I have my type there, which is my lead, and then I have a button. Okay, I hope you found this explanatory. And I hope it all makes sense. All right, so this is part one of our website build from Photoshop, to HTML. Okay, thank you. See you later.